Welcome to a special limited series podcast entitled What to Do in a Mental or Emotional Crisis and Where to Find Help. Now, in this series, we are going to shine the spotlight on mental health with a particular focus on resources that are available for anyone, particularly during periods of mental or emotional crisis, as well as giving information on self-help techniques to help you cope in some of life's most difficult moments. Now, I'm Michelle Russell, and some of you know me as a labor attorney who is passionate about labor matters, but I'm even more passionate about mental health. Now, later on in this episode, I'm actually going to share why it is that mental health is so important to me. Now, we cannot ignore the fact that the pandemic has had a negative effect on the mental health of several persons. Most persons felt this during the throes of the pandemic, but there's some people who are still feeling the effects of that. In fact, when you look at the statistics in Barbados, you'll realize that between 2021 and 2022, there have been 12 reported cases of suicide. And I say reported because not all suicides make the news. But more alarming is that 8 of these suicides took place during the first 8 months of 2022. And that is disturbing because prior to the pandemic, you might have seen 1 or 2 suicides for the year. So that this is a big jump, and we must ask the question, what is causing this? Now, in a sit down with Professor Dwayne Devonish, who did quite a number of research papers during the pandemic looking at the effects of the pandemic on mental health, I asked him his opinion on why he thought the pandemic caused such negative effects on the mental health of so many persons, and more importantly, why it is that we are seeing an increase in suicides even though we are now coming out of the pandemic. This is what he had to say.
Well, I mean, we can't neglect the fact that we're operating still within a pandemic type environment. And I know people would say, but you can't blame everything to in a pandemic to a pandemic. And the fact is that we have to be honest with ourselves. There are so many dimensions of how this pandemic has affected individuals. I mean, it's not
you've
just
done a lot of research on that. You have a number of papers out on that.
Yeah, actually, our most recent paper in 2021, we looked at the mental health impacts of the pandemic. And one of the things they highlighted that outside of things like job loss and loss of income, social isolation and so forth, the fear, that general fear of being infected and the severity of infection that potentially leads to death, all of those things coupled have exacerbated the mental health of many Barbadian people. So, I mean,
but we're now in 2022, where most people, the employment rate has gone back up. Most people have gotten back their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Or we've relaxed a lot of the protocols. People partying and everything again, and people who are getting infected, they're not getting as sick as when we had like Delta. The death rate is not as high as Delta, but yet the suicide rate is higher now than it was when the pandemic was in its throes.
Exactly. So I was going to say that after that study, one of the things that I've noticed that, as you correctly said, where there's that kind of waning of the what we call the heightened effects of the pandemic, the health effects of the pandemic and the job loss and the economic effects. Remember, there are still some lingering complications that are associated with the pandemic. So even though not everyone, people have regained their jobs and employment, not everyone actually has. So there's still that segment of the population who's suffering silently. And remember, a lot of the government efforts have scaled back in terms of interventions to support those who've been affected by the pandemic. Because as the pandemic waned, remember those particular crisis interventions and responses that were state-run and non-state-run have also waned in comparison with what's happening in the pandemic. So then you have a community of people who've left unsupported in the population. Now, let me just be frank. I mean, not everything is occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic and its complications, but it can be exacerbated by these complications. Now, let's think about it. We know that there was a rise in domestic violence in the pandemic. That has not disappeared. And in fact, that might have been worsened, even coming out of the recovery efforts in the pandemic. People are still going through tragedies. They're losing people, loved ones, close ones. So there's this kind of, I say, confluence of factors that are all
new word, confluence.
Yeah, coming together factors. Yeah, coming together factors. Yes, coming together factors that have all culminated in the kinds of mental health crisis events that we have seen to date.
Now, as Professor Devonish rightly said, not every mental health challenge or crisis is related to the pandemic. Some people had the mental health challenges prior to the pandemic, and some it's since the pandemic or after the pandemic, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic. The reality is, life presents challenges and difficult moments, and sometimes life is just hard. In a sit-down with consultant sociologist Dr. Veronica Evelyn, she explained why just living life can be stressful and how it can create issues for our mental health.
The kind of society that we live in now, we are almost constantly under stress, if we perceive it as stress. And sometimes we don't, but it's just there. And it is too much. So it's like a bridge and we break down, because there's too much on the bridge. You know, sometimes you go in overseas, if you're overseas, and you will see something that says such and such a ton, meaning vehicles that are heavier than that should not cross over. So imagine yourself as that vehicle, or that person at that bridge, and imagine the stressors as the weight. And if you're carrying too much weight for too long, with too little support, things go wrong. And so that, yes, stress will affect you and will affect your emotions quite a lot. And if you don't deal with it, it can degenerate. It can develop into a full-blown mental illness or some kind of mental instability, if you want to call it that.
Now to the question of why is the lawyer talking about mental health? Because the reality is it's a fair question, and as a lawyer I should be lawyering, in fact labor lawyering. Now I had my own sit down with the camera where I explained why I'm so passionate about this topic.
So for me personally, in my 20s, I was diagnosed with clinical depression. And I look back at it as 8 long years. But it was a very difficult time for me, and there was a lot going on in my life at the time. And essentially, I would just say life sucked. But what I remember the most about that period of my life is every New Year's Day, or the first day of the new year, I would wake up and I would cry. And you're probably wondering why. You see, every 31st of December, when I was going to bed, I would pray that I didn't wake up. Simply because I didn't want to have to go through another year of feeling hopeless, another year of feeling this continuous sadness that I couldn't get rid of, another year of feeling despair. I didn't want to have to continue to try to figure out life because I felt like I was failing and figuring it out. And so every New Year's Eve, I would pray that I did not wake up. And when I opened my eyes on the first day of the new year and realized that I woke up, I'd be so sad, I would just cry. And this continued for 8 years. And I can look back at it now and perhaps feel gratitude for the fact that that part of my life has passed. But like I said, something that stays with you. And for that reason, I have great empathy and compassion for those who struggle with their own mental health challenges, who struggle with clinical depression or just depression, whether momentary or ongoing, because I know it's not something you can just snap out of or get over. I also struggle with my own suicidal ideations, so I understand it from that point of view, and I have lost friends along the way who gave up trying and took their own lives. So I understand the level of loss where you look back and you wonder, could I have done something else? Did I fail as a friend, or it's hard. And so I thought that if we could put together this series where we teach people how to cope, because I know that's what changed my life. A whole host of things allowed me to come out of depression and to be able to continue to weather life and life's most difficult moments.
Now, one of the harshest realities of life is that life is hard and we cannot escape difficulties. Because life is cyclical. We go through seasons of good, seasons of bad, seasons of busyness, seasons of stillness. But one of the things we cannot do is escape difficulties. So that if you find yourself going through a particularly hard time right now, or an ongoing difficult time, I want you to remember that you are not alone, because every single one of us experience it at some point. It's just that some people are better at hiding it than others. In fact, if you're religious, or I should say a Christian, you might know that the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible actually says there's a time and season for everything under the sun. The point is, life doesn't stay the same. Life is always changing, and it changes between good, bad, wonderful, terrible. It is just life. Now, the Buddhists put it differently. They actually have as a foundational Buddhist principle that everything is impermanent. In other words, nothing lasts forever and nothing stays the same. And we see this in how we grow, both physically in size and height, as well as how we evolve in our views and our personality. In fact, even the cells in our bodies change every 7 years, where they essentially try to teach you that our suffering comes from our attachment to things, or our attachment to things the way they are. So that we like when our relationship is going good, so that when it stops going good, we suffer because we want it to get back to the way it was, and we want it to get back there quickly, except life is just not that simple. I asked some of our experts if they'd be willing to share with us some of their most difficult moments and the strategies they used to cope. This is what they had to say.
I would say 14 years ago, I had a burnout. It was a very dark place that I was in, and I decided that I needed to find out, one, why it was happening, two, how to never be in that space again. And as a result, I started a journey. I went and I got help from a psychologist. She actually, it was an interesting, psychologists, they do different modalities. But the first thing she introduced me to was breathing. And that triggered a whole series of investigation for myself.
But before you continue,
yes,
what did your burnout look like?
My burnout, what I can remember now, was sitting at my desk trying to work. I was working 20-hour days, 7 days a week. I was pretty much killing myself. And I remember sitting at my desk and working, typing away, and tears just flowing. I couldn't stop the tears. I couldn't think. A friend called me on the phone, and all I could say was, I just can't stop crying. I was shaking. I was just thinking, but I kept thinking I need to push through because I had deadlines to meet and all of that. And I remember his voice, and he told me, you need to get help. And I said, yes, I need help. And that's how the journey started. We started looking together, and we found, first I went to a psychiatrist. That didn't work for me. And then I went to a psychologist, and that started the process.
Now, I want to share with you some self-help techniques that I used or learned over the last, I would say, 12 years that have helped me to, number one, accept that life is difficult and I cannot escape. That no matter how good life gets, there will be a period where it's just not good, or a period that I just don't like, or a period that I'm struggling with. So that was the first thing. I had to learn to accept I cannot escape difficulties. And the second thing is that these are some of the techniques I use to cope when life gets inevitably difficult. Now, the first thing I learned is cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT. And what CBT is that it teaches you through talk therapy to challenge negative thought patterns that lead to negative behaviors or unwholesome behaviors, and that influence negative moods. So what it does, it teaches you to reframe the negative thoughts to something that is more wholesome. Now, Dr. Nicole LePera, in her book entitled How to Do the Work, and that should be showing on the screen now, How to Do the Work. So in her book, she essentially calls it, what story are you telling yourself? And she encourages you to challenge the story you're telling yourself. And it sounds like a general principle, but it really means, what story are you telling yourself about yourself, about your relationships, about your future, about your job, about your present, about your past, about what someone said or did to you? So it teaches you to be self-aware and pay attention to the thoughts running through your mind and the story you are telling yourself and the meaning you are attaching to events. But that leads me to the next part of CBT, was that I had to learn to avoid catastrophizing events. And hopefully that's showing on the screen, avoiding catastrophizing. And catastrophizing sounds like a big word, but it is the practice. They call it a cognitive distortion. In other words, it's not a good way to think, but it is the practice of thinking the worst possible thing. So worst case scenario. That's how you always see life. So a good example is that you might be on an airplane and the pilot comes on the intercom or the mic or whatever, and the pilot says, well, passengers, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence right now. Please tighten your seatbelts. Catastrophizing in that event looks like, Lord, mega dead, me know me should not take this flight. Lord, me should have stayed home. Lord, me never write my will. Me not gonna see me pitting them again, mega dead. And let me tell you about Michelle Russell. I was the queen of catastrophizing. So that any difficult moment I had, I would automatically go to worst case scenario. And through cognitive behavioral therapy, and of course the what story are you telling yourself, I learned to stop catastrophizing and to just accept the event for what it is. So for instance, the pilot says we're going through turbulence, and I say, okay, I better buckle my seatbelt. But I don't automatically go to worst case scenario unless there is a foundational reason for going there. Like if you see the wing of the plane on fire, or you start to take a nosedive. But outside of empirical evidence of some sort that would suggest the worst case is about to happen, I've learned to stop myself from going there and take things at face value only. There is turbulence, I can tighten my seatbelt, I will be safe. If it gets worse, the pilot will tell us, and then I'll make a plan at that point. So that's two things. CBT, what story are you telling yourself, and avoiding catastrophizing events. Another one is to avoid compounding, and compounding really happens when everything is going wrong at the same time. And I'm looking at all of them and feeling the weight of it, and feeling the panic, and feeling the anxiety, and feeling like depressed, and it's like, why me? And when you avoid compounding, you take one problem at a time. You're aware that several things are happening at the same time, but you don't allow your mind to think of them all at the same time, or to try to come up with solutions all at the same time. You say, okay, today I'm going to deal with the dog, and I'm going to deal with the stomachache. Tomorrow I'm going to deal with the electricity, etc., etc. And you find that when you can break things down into bite-sized pieces, you're less likely to feel overwhelmed, less likely to have anxiety and panic. So if there was anything helpful in this episode, feel free to rewind, fast forward, etc., and share with your friends and family members. But I want to make it clear that the information presented in this series is not intended to be a substitute for medical or professional advice, and we encourage you to seek help from a certified professional in circumstances that merit it, especially if you're suffering with a psychiatric illness. If you or someone you know is having a particularly difficult time right now, I would encourage you to reach out to any of these hotline numbers to get some social support. In our next episode, we're going to talk about different ways we cope. I speak to members of the public to hear how they cope, and then have the experts speak to us and tell us if some of these coping mechanisms are healthy, and in some instances they suggest healthier ways. So thank you for joining me. See you then, and make your mental wellness a priority. Bye.